Opening the center immediately, e4 stakes a claim for vital space and prepares to develop pieces towards the king's flank. Embracing Sicilian imbalance, black immediately contests central pawns, promising dynamic asymmetrical positions. Developing a knight to challenge black's central pawn control and prepare for quick king safety is a classic strategy. Establishing a solid central presence, knight development now prepares for potential d5 thrusts and controls crucial dark squares. Bolstering the center's influence, this develops another piece, preparing for a potential d4 push and fighting for central space. Embracing a fianchetto, black aims to control the long diagonal and prepare a kingside buildup. Unlocking the center immediately contests black's queenside pawn structure and opens lines for rapid development. Opening the c-file signals an immediate intent to challenge the center, setting up a dynamic struggle for central control. Centralizing the knight now grabs crucial space and targets black's pawn structure, initiating a strategic race. Black solidifies the fianchetto, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially exploit the d-file. Solidifying the pawn center while preparing to castle, this bishop's placement eyes the d5 square, hinting at potential long-term pressure and offering support for a future kingside attack. Developing the knight to f6 harmonizes with the fianchettoed bishop, setting the stage for central pawn advances or a strategic kingside castle. Observe how this piece now eyes both d5 and e4, subtly contesting central influence and preparing for potential pawn breaks like d6 or e5. This maneuver neatly avoids immediate tactical skirmishes and emphasizes harmonious development, aiming for a solid, well-coordinated position. Casting a watchful eye towards black's kingside, white aims to exploit the developing piece choreography and prepare for potential kingside pressure. Securing the monarch immediately addresses potential king safety concerns that arise from black's pawn structure and the open central files, a prudent step before committing further pieces to active central play and preparing for a potential kingside assault by white's bishops. Centering the bishop on the long diagonal, this maneuver prepares to pressure the kingside and potentially create imbalances. The bishop now eyes the queenside weaknesses, offering flexibility should black's pawn structure shift. It also avoids immediate confrontation with the knight, allowing piece development to continue smoothly. Observe how the active piece placement hints at future attacking possibilities and control over key diagonals. Bringing the rook to the central file, the e-pawn now finds solid support, preparing to challenge the d4 pawn or potentially reinforce a future kingside attack, while simultaneously freeing the g8 bishop to join the defensive network. Unbalancing the pawn structure is the immediate aim, exchanging knights to create a doubled pawn for black on the c-file, potentially hindering their queenside development and creating a permanent weakness. This offers white a subtle positional advantage, aiming to exploit the pawn structure for long-term pressure. Doubling pawns opens the d-file for black's rook and creates a central pawn majority, but weakens the pawn structure around the king. This is a fundamental trade-off to consider. Securing the king's safety by preemptively blocking any potential knight outpost on g4 adds a layer of defensive solidity, even if it slightly restricts the bishop's diagonal. Asserting central influence, the queen now eyes the long diagonal, potentially creating future attacking opportunities or reinforcing the central pawn structure, while also preparing to support a pawn push like e5 later. Unleashing a pawn thrust like this drastically alters the pawn structure, aiming to seize more central space and prepare an assault on the kingside. But it also opens up the e-file for potential counterplay and weakens the d4 square. Expanding on the queen side, black seeks to disrupt white's central control and gain a foothold for their pieces. This thrust aims to create complications and potentially exploit the open c-file later. Unleashing a pawn thrust into the enemy's heartland, this audacious advance aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain crucial central space. The immediate consequence is the forced repositioning of black's knight, potentially sacrificing tempo or creating weaknesses if not handled with precision. It also opens the e-file for white's rook, hinting at future aggressive intentions along that corridor. The strategic ambition here is to cramp black's development and prepare for a decisive kingside assault by leveraging the increased pawn cover. Black's advance of the b-pawn aggressively challenges White's central pawn structure and aims to disrupt White's bishop's influence on the long diagonal, forcing a strategic decision about its placement and potentially opening lines for counterplay on the queenside. The knight embarks on a strategic repositioning, aiming to influence the queenside and potentially disrupt Black's pawn structure while avoiding the immediate threat on the d-file. This maneuver acknowledges the compromised pawn structure after Black's doubled c-pawns and seeks to exploit the open b-file with its subsequent advance, aiming to create dynamic imbalances. Instantly grappling with the encroaching knight, Black redirects energy to the center and seeks to neutralize White's spatial advantage, creating a dynamic pawn structure. White aims to exploit the temporary weakness created by Black's doubled pawns on the queenside, particularly the c-file, and prepares to launch an assault on the kingside. The queen now stands poised to participate in the coming offensive, potentially supporting pawn advances or directly engaging Black's king. Consider the geometric implications of this placement. It influences squares like d5 and f6 and creates potential battery formations with the bishop on b3. Black must now carefully assess the threat and find a way to consolidate their position, possibly by developing the remaining pieces or reinforcing key squares. Black strategically dissolves central pawn tension, sacrificing a pawn for crucial development and opening lines. This exchange clears the way for the bishop on g7 to find a more active diagonal, while also eliminating White's potentially disruptive knight on c3. Although a pawn down, Black gains significant counterplay potential on the queenside and aims to exploit the open files that will emerge. It's a bold choice, seeking dynamic compensation rather than solidifying the pawn structure. Instantly seizing the initiative with the queen, White aims to exploit Black's somewhat passive pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. The exchange of knights, particularly the removal of Black's nc6, has given White a slight edge in central influence, and now the queen directly challenges Black's queenside expansion, forcing a reaction. Black's queenside push, immediately confronting the knight on a4, aims to disrupt White's established structure and potentially gain space, though it risks creating weaknesses and overextending pawns. Unleashing the king from its usual sanctuary opens up the long diagonal for the queen and rook, aggressively staking a claim on the queenside flank and daring Black to challenge the pawn chain. The queen's repositioning to a7 initiates a fascinating tactical geometry, aiming to exploit the awkwardness of White's knight on a4 and simultaneously create threats against the queenside pawn structure. Black's maneuver seeks to open up lines for counterplay, perhaps targeting the c-file or creating a passed pawn on the queenside if White isn't careful with their piece placement. This move signals a shift from defensive solidity to active aggression, demanding a sharp response from White to prevent Black's initiative from blossoming. Shifting the queen to the king's flank creates a dynamic interplay, eyeing the vulnerable dark squares around Black's king while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn pushes like f5. This repositioning hints at a desire to exploit the weakened kingside that arose from Black's earlier pawn structure choices. The bishop now actively eyeballs the queenside expansion, eyeing potential breakthroughs along the a5-e1 diagonal. Unlocking the queenside and creating attacking possibilities, this maneuver aims to exploit the open files and pressure Black's somewhat cramped position, while also preparing for potential advances on the queenside. Challenging White's monarch with a bold infiltration, this check brilliantly exploits the open diagonal, forcing a decisive reshuffling of pieces and potentially creating weaknesses around the enemy king. Securing the monarch is paramount. Shifting the king away from the immediate open file, especially with Black's queen poised for further infiltrations, is a prudent defensive maneuver, prioritizing king's safety above all else in this dynamic, open position where tactical opportunities are rife. A well-timed retreat, the bishop vacates the diagonal, rerouting itself towards the center and potentially eyeing the kingside if the opportunity arises. Seeking to re-establish central control and simplify the position, White's queen shifts to d4, intending to offer a queen trade or at least contest the e-file's influence. The king's safety on the queenside is becoming a pressing concern, and this maneuver might offer a path toward a less complicated middle game, though it also invites further pawn advances from black. Striking at the heart of white's recently castled king, this queen exchange drastically alters the positional landscape, inviting an endgame where pawn weaknesses on the queen side might become a primary concern for white. The rook's triumphant entry onto the d-file immediately asserts crucial central control, pinning black's remaining knight and preparing to exploit the now open lines towards the queen side. A strategic repositioning unfolds, aiming to activate the rook and challenge white's queenside pawn structure. Reclaiming the initiative on the open d-file is paramount, and consolidating control their positions white to actively contest the central squares and potentially exploit the weakened structure black has developed. A welcome simplification, trading queens now avoids the sting of any future discovered attacks or tactical skirmishes stemming from their prominent placement, allowing both sides to focus on developing their remaining forces and solidifying their positions. Reclaiming the central file reestablishes a crucial presence, enabling a flexible defense against potential pawn advances, and preparing to contest the now open d-file for future action. Reactivating the bishop on c8 injects a much-needed defensive presence along the queenside diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially exploit the weakened a5 pawn. A daring repositioning, the knight abandons the contested d4 square, aiming for a more active outpost on b6 where it can eye vulnerable c8 and potentially disrupt black's rook coordination. Seizing the initiative by challenging the encroaching knight, this pawn advance injects immediate dynamism into the position. Rethinking the immediate pawn push, the rook repositions, seeking more active central influence and preparing to contest the open files that have emerged. Unleashing an assault on the kingside, black initiates a daring pawn thrust, aiming to dismantle white's defensive structure and expose the king. Liberating the d-file for immediate penetration, this redeployment of the rook establishes a potent outpost, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially isolate the knight. Initiating pawn confrontation here transforms the central complexion, aiming to fracture white's nascent queenside control and potentially unlock attacking avenues. Suddenly, a decisive pawn grab simplifies the material, creating immediate tactical opportunities and forcing black to reevaluate their previously aggressive pawn push. Unleashing the pawn storm, black attempts to disrupt white's pawn structure and open diagonals for the bishop, a bold offensive maneuver aiming for tactical disruption rather than a quiet positional consolidation. Opening that kingside pawn structure now potentially exposes your monarch to threats from black's bishop and rook, turning a solid defense into a precarious situation with the ensuing open g-file. The bishop's adventurous sortie to h3 is an aggressive attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially expose the king, a bold gamble given the current material balance. The rook emerges from its defensive post, aggressively challenging the opponent's pawn structure and aiming to reclaim initiative on the queen side. Reigniting the active rook, this maneuver immediately challenges white's compromised pawn structure and aims to exploit the open d-file for counterplay, forcing white to react to black's aggressive initiative. Asserting control over the queen side, white's immediate action with the pawn aims to disrupt black's potential expansion and create a rigid pawn structure that could become a weakness later. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority, this advance creates a dynamic imbalance, demanding white's immediate attention to prevent a runaway passed pawn, while simultaneously exposing white's kingside to potential future pressure as the game simplifies. Opening the b-file, white aims to activate the rook for pressure against black's queenside pawns, though this comes at the cost of creating an isolated pawn on the queenside. Black shores up the central pawn chain, a necessary stabilization after the pawn exchange on the queenside, aiming to solidify their structure before considering any further advancements or counterplay. A strategic retreat, this king's relocation aims to escape the open files pressure and prepare for potential pawn advancement, seeking a safer haven while repositioning forces for the upcoming struggles. Embarking on a pawn push on the king's side, black aims to create a pawn chain that might eventually disrupt white's central grip and potentially generate counterplay. The intention here is to break open lines on the king's side, forcing white to commit their pieces and possibly creating weaknesses around the white king. This ambitious maneuver seeks to exploit any overextension or misplacement of white's pieces, leveraging the pawn's aggressive advance to gain initiative. Observe how this pawn's journey could alter the dynamics of the position, perhaps by opening a pathway for black's rooks or influencing the bishop's scope. Consider the strategic implications of this pawn's advance. It's a bold attempt to introduce complexity and challenge white's current comfortable setup. The question is whether this aggressive forward thrust will ultimately strengthen black's position or overextend their forces, creating vulnerabilities to be exploited. It's a dynamic choice, seeking to seize the initiative by actively contesting space and threatening to unravel white's defensive structure. Securing the rook on its current advanced perch aims to prevent black from achieving a crucial pawn breakthrough, while also preparing for potential counterplay along the open c-file should the opportunity arise. Reclaiming material and solidifying the pawn structure on the queen side is the primary objective, forcing white's knight out of its dominant outpost. Reclaiming the open file with the rook immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and prepares for future incursions onto the 7th rank, potentially creating mating threats or winning more material. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on the long diagonal offers a more active role than passively defending, aiming to pressure white's isolated pawns and potentially create weaknesses on the king side. Retreating the rook to e1 opens up the e-file for potential future action, while simultaneously safeguarding the piece from any immediate threats along the 7th rank. Unleashing a pawn's advance can inject vital dynamism into a stagnant position, aiming to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses, though it does require careful calculation to avoid leaving it vulnerable or creating counterplay for the adversary. Unleashing a forcing check, white aims to disrupt black's recently acquired space on the king side and potentially expose the monarch. Seeking to escape the imminent danger and regroup the beleaguered monarch, the king ventures out from the oppressive pawn structure, aiming to find sanctuary on the king side before the encroaching white pieces can exploit its current exposed position and potential weaknesses on the dark squares. Clearing the d-file allows the knight to hop into a more active central square, potentially forcing tactical concessions from black's advanced pawns and aiming to disrupt their defensive structure. The bishop now retreats, but can it truly escape the looming pawn storm and secure a safe haven on this open board? Unleashing the rook's power along the open file, this aggressive advance aims to exploit the now exposed black king, forcing a critical reevaluation of defensive structures and potentially creating decisive mating threats. A bold attempt to activate the rook, aiming to exploit the open d-file and disrupt white's reorganized pieces. Unleashing the knight towards the center often aims to exploit pawn weaknesses or create dynamic outposts. This particular deployment, however, feels a bit like chasing shadows given black's consolidated pawn structure on the queen side and the active bishop pair still poised for action. A strategic repositioning, aiming to redeploy the bishop to a more active square and perhaps prepare for future pawn pushes on the queen side, creating potential breakthroughs. Repositioning the pawn advances the queenside presence, potentially supporting a future advance or creating space for other pieces, while simultaneously defending against black's active rook. The bishop seeks to reposition, aiming to exert pressure along the open h-file and potentially prepare for an attack on the white king, which appears somewhat exposed given the pawn structure. The white rook's advance to the 5th rank aims to leverage its newfound freedom, seeking out targets on the king side while simultaneously supporting the pawn push that threatens to unravel black's defenses. The bishop's return to the fray, after being seemingly sidelined, now initiates a potent threat along the weakened dark squares surrounding white's monarch, potentially setting up a delightful exchange that simplifies into a more favorable pawn structure. Activating the rook along the now clear 7th rank is crucial for threatening the weakened black king and challenging the active black bishop. The rooks now engage in a tense dance across the board, aiming to exploit the open files and potentially create a breakthrough. The rook boldly advances to the 6th rank, aiming to infiltrate black's territory and disrupt the pawn structure. Seeking to reignite activity in the lingering game, black repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to support the advance of the passed pawn and potentially contest the crucial a-file now that white's pawn structure has been fractured. Repositioning the rook to the central file aims to disrupt black's entrenched bishop and potentially activate this piece into the fray, forcing a re-evaluation of the board's dynamic. The rook sidesteps, seeking an active outpost on the 4th rank,